Last attempt to go the extra mile. On Capitol Hill, the United States Congress has canceled its traditional recess. With more about the new Bush offer, White House correspondent Wyatt Andrews.
Having failed to make a deal for direct talks with Saddam Hussein, President Bush launched a last-ditch effort to meet Saddam's foreign minister. The White House said Secretary of State Baker would be available for talks in Geneva the first 3 days of next week.
While the president is not prepared to repeat his previous offer rejected by Saddam Hussein, he is ready to make one last attempt to go the extra mile for peace.
Yet the prospect that these talks will produce a breakthrough seems slim, and the prospect for peace is slimmer. The White House says its sole purpose for seeking talks at all is to deliver a face-to-face ultimatum.
No negotiations, no compromises, no attempts at face-saving, and no rewards for aggression.
Then why talk at all? As much as anything, the president's gestures seem designed to convince nervous allies and a cautious Congress he's done everything to avoid war. Congressional leaders told Mr. Bush today they're not sure he has, and that if he asked for Congress's permission to use force today, he would lose.
The substantive disagreement is whether the resort to force should be early or whether the resort to force should be a truly last resort only after all other means have been exhausted.
I don't think we've exhausted the sanctions. I think the sanctions can still achieve the result without going to the final step of war.
At least some members believe the president's mind is already fixed on war.
I think for better or for worse, we've crossed the Rubicon. I think the question is not when or not whether we're going to have a war, but when.
What happens next, from a full congressional debate to a full declaration of war, now hinges completely on whether Iraq says yes to a Baker meeting and what happens if that meeting occurs. That's why, as much as the president's offer is a last attempt at peace, it's also the latest White House attempt to prove Saddam isn't interested. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, the White House.
If the offer of talks represents one last attempt at diplomacy, the U.S.'s chief diplomat today warned Iraq of the consequences of rejecting that route.
Iraq must now choose to quit the soil of its peaceful neighbor or risk devastating consequences.
Secretary Baker was attending the swearing-in of a new U.S. ambassador to Kuwait, Edward Ghanim, now the absentee chief of an abandoned embassy in an overrun country. Conditions the U.S. today again vowed to change one way or another. The Kuwaitis seem to be leaning more toward devastation and less toward diplomacy as the way to remove Iraq from their country.
I think this is another step that the president has taken and has been termed as another extra mile. And let's hope that we don't run out of mileage here.
Part of the gloominess is based on Saddam's continued buildup in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The Pentagon said today Iraqi troops there now total 530,000, an increase of 20,000 in barely a week.
Iraq is making no move to withdraw its forces from the Kuwaiti theater of operations.
And part of the gloominess stems from the downscaling of diplomatic expectations. The U.S. is now offering to meet not Saddam Hussein, but Tariq Aziz, who may be Iraq's foreign minister, but who is a man of doubtful influence in Baghdad. He's considered a messenger boy, and if the meeting happens, will be given a simple message.
And so as January 15 approaches, we are closer and closer to restoring Kuwait's sovereignty, whether by peace or whether by force.
The Iraqis have been given until Saturday to respond to this latest offer of talks. In this crisis of deadlines, add another. Mark Phillips, CBS News, the State Department.
What is Iraq's reaction to the proposal for new peace talks? Here's Scott Pelley in Baghdad.
The Iraqi leadership discussed the new U.S. proposal tonight, but announced no decision on whether to accept. The so-called last chance offer was delivered by the ranking U.S. diplomat in Baghdad.
The president and the secretary have made it very, very clear that we would like to have a diplomatic and political solution to this crisis. And we will go the extra mile to try and achieve that goal.
Previously, Saddam Hussein had rejected the idea of a meeting in which the United States would dictate its terms and refuse to negotiate. But now a senior Iraqi official tells CBS News his government is likely to accept even that precondition. Secretary Baker will make his points, the official said, and we will make ours. The U.S. initiative was the most important development in a day of diplomacy on the brink. Near Tripoli, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak began an emergency summit with the presidents of Libya, Syria, and Sudan. In Islamabad, foreign ministers gathered from Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey. And in Baghdad, an envoy close to French President Francois Mitterrand arrived for talks.
I'm here for peace. It's time for talking about peace.
And in London today, King Hussein of Jordan began a new round of diplomacy. Iraqi relations with the British deteriorated this afternoon when 8 Iraqi diplomats were expelled from London, along with 63 other Iraqi citizens. The government cited national security reasons. Yesterday, a senior Iraqi official told CBS News Iraq would be flexible on meeting dates if the U.S. would initiate an offer. The Iraqis have been eager for a meeting, and now the world waits for word. Scott Pelley, CBS News, Baghdad.
New session of Congress convened today. This time, the Congress will stay in session straight through without its usual recess. Some members of Congress returned to Washington insisting that President Bush abide by Congress's constitutional role, as they see it, to declare war, that President Bush not go it alone in committing American troops to combat. With more about that, our chief Washington correspondent, Bob Schieffer.
Raise your right hand. The 102nd Congress was hardly sworn in before coming face to face with troubling questions about its own role in deciding whether to go to war. Backbench senators turned a planned day of ceremony into an argument over whether Congress should take immediate steps to limit the president's hand.
We wish to have an opportunity to put in a resolution that would state that the president cannot carry out offensive actions without authorization of the Congress.
Caught off guard, Majority Leader Mitchell was left in an awkward fix, having already warned the president not to move on Iraq without congressional approval. He was forced to side with the administration today, feeling debate now might undermine the new offer to send the Secretary of State to Geneva.
Is that what we want to do? Is that constructive? Is that useful?
This senator does not in any way believe that debating the issue of constitutional powers of the presidency in any way undermines the United States of America. Never, never, never.
A resolution defining those powers was introduced in the House as Secretary Baker and Defense Secretary Cheney spent the afternoon here making the administration's case. They'd like a vote of unqualified support, but the House Republican leader concedes they'll never get that from the Democrats.
Want the president to take all the heat himself and at the same time give themselves cover so that they can, in whatever situation, always be able to sit back and criticize.
Whatever the case, after a month back home listening to constituents, Congress today seemed more wary than ever about plunging into war in the Persian Gulf. Bob Schieffer, CBS News at the Capitol.
Straight ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News from Saudi Arabia, more about the Gulf crisis as we continue our...
in a single day. Some of these aircraft have been here since August, but for most of that time they were located at a base outside Saudi Arabia. They were moved here for one very specific reason.
The main thing is that we're a lot closer to the target area than we were before, and as I said this morning, that makes me very happy.
It would take these F-15s about an hour to reach Baghdad, probably striking at night and carrying a payload of up to 12 500-pound bombs.
Dropping 12 of them, you don't have to be right dead center every time, but you're well within 30 feet to 50 feet, probably.
The pilots believe they can knock out Saddam Hussein's air defenses in fairly short order.
I think the skies are going to be clear in just a matter of days.
The buildup here began shortly after President Bush ordered in reinforcements in November. Before that, there was nothing here but a runway. Now, with pilots doing double duty as carpenters, there are more than 600 tents housing several thousand airmen. It's not as austere as some of the Army and Marine bases closer to the front, but then it depends what you mean by austere.
They've done pretty well here, except the only thing is clothes and lingerie. They don't have good laundry.
Some of America's best technology has been deployed here, but technology has its limits. These F-16s flown by the South Carolina Air National Guard could be taken out of action by a sandstorm.
It just makes it tough to really define things, and the things in the desert aren't real well defined anyway.
Even if these planes found all their targets, that would not be enough.
The Air Force is not going to win this war if we have one. If the business of winning a war has to do with capturing territory and moving dirt, that's what the Army and the Marines are here to do.
If it happens, these pilots would be flying 2 and 3 combat missions a day, some of them not coming back. The U.S. may hold a commanding advantage in high-tech weapons, but in war there are no quick fixes. David Martin, CBS News, Saudi Arabia.
Joining me now is our longtime Middle East correspondent, Bob Simon. Bob, first reaction to the Middle East to President Bush's new proposal?
No surprise, Dan. Everyone here expected a flurry of diplomatic activity before the 15th. The feeling in the Middle East generally is that President Bush would like to avoid a war if he possibly can. Those countries that feel the same way, Egypt and Jordan, for example, are delighted with today's news. Those countries that feel that a war is necessary, Israel notably, are extremely skeptical.
Inside Israel, where are they looking for the telltale signs?
The Israelis are convinced that if President Bush launches a war against Iraq,